Musical Talk, the UK independent musical theatre podcast.
Hello, welcome to Musical Talk. My name is Nick Hudson. I'm joined...
With sellotape.
I'm joined here by Thos. Hello, Thos.
Who, unlike sellotape, I'm a staple of this programme.
Or centrefold.
I hope not.
How are you?
Generally, I'm absolutely fine. Specifically, none of your business.
Okay. A hodgepodge, I think, is what we were saying before we started to record. Little bits of musical talk here and there.
It's a culled collation of conversation.
Thank you for the title. And I want to start, but I know we talked about it before, but I want to tell Thos about it, because I know you're a big pantomime fan.
I love a big pantomime. And in fact, I think you may have seen the biggest one in London, didn't you?
I did. I saw Dick Whittington at the London Palladium, which we have talked about before.
Well, everyone loves a big dick.
Which we have talked about before. It still remains one of my greatest memories of recent theatrical trips. I even saw it twice.
For people who don't know, there was a long tradition of having enormous pantomimes in London, usually at the London Palladium, for years and years and years.
When are we talking?
I think we're talking all the way through most of the 20th century, up until the 70s. And occasionally they would be something a bit different, like Cinderella, the Rodgers and Hammerstein TV musical, which I know came over to London and was staged at the Palladium with Kenneth Williams, I think, as one of the ugly sisters. And you can hear him. Well, you can hear him on the soundtrack recording, which is lovely. And Jimmy Edwards was the king, and it was a stellar production. But usually it was, a specially written pantomime. And then somehow pantomime went into the doldrums a little bit in the 1970s, certainly at a big scale. And it just stopped coming to London, and the Palladium did other shows. And so pantomime, if you wanted to see a pantomime in London, you had to go to a local pantomime. You went to
the Empire.
Yes, or the Richmond Theatre, or whatever it was. And they carried on doing it, and there was lots of amateur pantomimes. And so pantomime carried on. But if you like, the big pinnacle, the big come-and-see-it pantomimes suddenly died out. And it's been an amazing surprise to me that the last couple of Christmases there's been an attempt, and I hope a successful one, to revive it in London. Now, I didn't see Cinderella in 2016, and I didn't see Dick Whittington this year, partly because I must tell you, I was involved in joke doctoring a pantomime somewhere else. This may come as a surprise to our listeners, but some people think that one or two of my jokes are tolerably amusing, and I get asked to put them into other people's pantomimes. So I've done a bit of that just recently. But I really am kicking myself not to have seen this year's Dick Whittington, or this last Christmas's Dick Whittington, because once again a stellar cast, one or two retreads I think from the year before, although no problem with that. But of course the amazing Charlie Stemp, and you saw him, I think.
Underused, I would say, for Charlie Stemp. He can certainly move.
Gosh, yes.
The issue is when
he moves me.
When you're up against Julian Clary, Elaine Page, Paul Zerdin, a 30-foot tall rat, a flying bus, a flying boat, he and Emma Williams are matched perfectly, and I'm sure
she's Alice Fitzwarren, I'm guessing.
She was Alice. Also underused. They had...
funny enough, sorry, a complete interruption, and I'm very sorry, but in a totally different environment, wearing a totally different hat, I actually had to research Dick Whittington today for my professional life, which is in the civil service.
Happening at the council, Thos?
Yeah, it's a civil service thing, but it was to research the history of...
history of mayors and how they are elected.
It was the history of mayors, absolutely, and I can therefore tell you that Dick Whittington was first elected to office in 1397. And he actually was. Yes, but it's the year, it's 1397, which is a long time ago. And he was actually married to Alice Fitzwarren.
Wow.
They're both true.
Did he rid the town of rats, voiced by Elaine Page?
He did not. No. But he got the equivalent of £4 million off Richard II for London, which is then one of the many reasons he was then re-elected several times, because basically he got a rebate of taxes. Anyway, enough of real history. Let's talk about Charlie Stemp again.
The things you learn on this podcast. Yeah, so Charlie Stemp was typical hero, thigh slapping and 12 o'clock and still no sign of dick and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But
Yes, can I ask you a question then? How much smut was in it? Because there's a trend in modern life.
I mean, how much Julian Clary was in it?
Oh, well, I suppose Julian Clary would bring that quotient right up because, and I've made this point before on Musical Talk, some people mistake pantomime for children's shows and they strip it of anything that might have a double entendre and then it becomes unwatchable. Whereas the secret is to have proper double entendre, which are, you only get if you get. What pitch would you? I mean, you don't want too much because you don't want it to become a smutty show. No. I don't like these adult pantomimes because actually I think they miss the point.
Davidson and things.
Yes, and worse. But
Cinderella with an S.
Yeah, exactly that kind of. It had Charlie Drake in it, I think, years ago.
Well, when you have Elaine Page and Julian Clary singing "I Know Him So Well" from Chess, but they changed the lyrics to "I Know Dick So Well," that kind of gives you the level of what we're talking about.
So they didn't shy away from a little bit of naughtiness, which I'm very pleased by because it sounds then it had all the traditional elements of a proper.
I mean, Gary Wilmot was in it as well, and he's always a joy to watch. And he played the mother, the
Widow Twankey, or the dame,
the dame, who in this
won't be Widow Twankey. That's
in this story runs a sweet shop, and it has a wonderful routine where she talks about how she met her husband using massive chocolate bars. So we have things like, so he whispered in my ear.
Was there a bounty on his head?
Yeah, and all that kind of stuff, and betwixt this, and you should see the size of his curly whirly, and then, he whipped my Snickers off and all that kind of stuff. But he also, and I've never seen a pantomime with a mid-standing ovation, mid-performance, but he did a song where he sang every single tube station in London to the tune of the Can-Can.
He says, or the Barbie Can-Can, under the circumstances.
He wrote it himself.
Did he now? I mean, he's an amazing talent, Gary Wilmot.
And how
why he's not doing more things, I don't know. But
how he remembers that.
Yeah.
I said to Emma, there must be an auto cue or something. No, she said, no, he just absolutely remembers it.
But it's a Tom Lehrer school, isn't it? I mean, if you can learn, Tom Lehrer took I Am the Very Model of a Modern Major General and turned it into The Elements.
Yes.
And he learnt that and performed it, and at speed. So anyone can with enough.
Can.
Hey, but you can if you put enough effort in. And Gary Wilmot is an absolute professional.
So you have Julian Clary. There are smutty moments, but you also have Elaine Page making fun of herself,
she's a great giggler.
She's got a wonderful laugh, and there's great, and dare I use the term, banter between Elaine Page and Julian Clary. Because Julian Clary kind of played it knowing that she was playing Elaine Page playing the villain. So we had this wonderful line where Elaine Page says, "I don't know what I'm doing here." And Julian Clary said, "We could have got Marty Webb for £5 extra, so just be happy you're here." So it's very... And then you have Nigel Havers in it as well. Havers, who is playing Nigel Havers because he didn't have a very big part last year and he's got a bigger part this year. So they're
playing on themselves.
They're playing on the brand of the pantomime at the Palladium. And you have original songs. And you have very fun pop songs. You have amazing special effects. I mean, you've never seen anything like this.
I suspect this is the kind of thing that's going to appeal to you more, because if you're at the Palladium, you're going to expect a bit of money to have been spent.
Yes.
And, of course, you've also got all the facilities and infrastructure that the Palladium can give you, which, frankly, you're not going to see at the Tramshed Carl Shorten, Whereas, for me, the joy of pantomime is the ability to create an atmosphere, and an atmosphere of, essentially, joviality and fun. And that came across?
Absolutely. It's very, very funny. Not one moment of seriousness in it. Anytime there's any threat of seriousness, someone comes on. There's a very, very good routine of the 12 Days of Christmas, which all goes horribly wrong. But there's not your traditional... It's not a pantomime in the sense that there's no ghost scene. There's no "it's behind you." There's none of that. So it's
but there is audience involvement.
Yeah, there's.
Oh yes, he is. Oh no, she isn't. Sure.
Tiny bit, but it's
really?
Act 2 is more of a variety because nothing happens in Act 2 of a pantomime.
Well, let me tell you, nothing happens in Act 2 of Dick Whittington in particular. Yes. The plot of Act 2 is always, let's go to the island. Let's come back from the island.
The end.
Yeah, basically, we damaged the rat there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Really, and everything else is filler. So you can do that. And once again, the Palladium has a huge history of that kind of variety show, doesn't it?
So it's more of a variety show. But my God, you get your money's worth.
But let's go back to the musical elements. You were saying there were lots of different things. So can you remember some of the songs? I take it they were the traditional panto thing of pulling things from popular culture. Were there pop songs? Were there musical theatre references? With Elaine Page, I'd have thought you get something.
Elaine Page comes on and sings all her hits. So we have I Know Him So Well.
A melody medley.
And she comes on and she sings, she's playing the Queen Rat. E.T., as Julian Clary calls her. I'm going to sing my biggest hit, because I might be old, but I still have it in me. Memory. Can't remember the rest.
Yeah, it's a good gag.
And you have I'd Rather Be Up a Drain Pipe, and you had the Sunset Boulevard one. I bet about how much I love being a villain and how it's the part I've always wanted to play. So
can I just make obscure reference time? I bet she didn't sing a song from The Barrier.
No, she didn't. Act 2 opens within a navy.
Yeah, well, of course, because they're on the ship to go
to. Julian Clary is lowered down on a massive bell, and they sing "Ring My Bell." So they're choosing the right kind of music for the right characters.
Any musical... Well, you've said Elaine Page gets most of the musical references. It sounds like most of the other people get sort of popular hits. Any other unusual musical references? The reason I ask is sometimes I've seen in professional pantomime where the musical director has had a bit of a joke. So I remember one where time was passing in a pantomime, and it hadn't had any kind of musical theatre references in it particularly before. It had all been pop songs, and then suddenly
time played.
Well, no, they had perpetual anticipation from a little night music sort of snuck into the transitional music to let you know that time was passing, and you thought that's an obscure reference for most people here.
I mean, what I like most about the Elaine Page stuff is they change the lyrics, so it's not just the songs. Sondheim gets reference, Angela Weber gets reference. We have Angela Weber's Sweet Shop on the stage. But it's the original stuff that really surprised me, because
so there were original songs.
There was an original opening number.
Oh, jolly good.
There's original song to end that one where he's flying the bus over the audience, in a reference, I think, to Chitty Chitty Bang Bang,
and possibly Priscilla.
Yes. Does the bus fly over the audience?
It does not, but there is a bus. Honestly, when you're looking at musical theatre with buses in it, we've mentioned the two big ones and possibly Summer Holiday with Cliff Richard.
This is an episode coming from Thos soon.
Well, Bus Watch.
On the bus.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just seemed to be something really funny, very in for musical theatre, but then you have diversity in it, who won X Factor or something like that. They're a dance troupe playing the Sultan, and they play the Sultan and his henchmen, which is quite fun. Paul Zerden in it, the very, very good ventriloquist.
Very funny man. Funny enough, he's worked with Nigel Havers before, because I saw both of them before they were really pantomime stalwarts a few years ago. Paul Zerden at the time wasn't that famous, and Nigel Havers, I think, was making his panto debut. But I think he was playing Baron Snodybroke in Cinderella at the Richmond Theatre. So
I saw Paul Zerden on the Royal Variety performance about 1995, so he's been doing this for a very long time. This is his second year doing it, so I don't see him staying on for the third year, because I think a lot of it was recycled material. But he had some wonderful jokes. What's a shih tzu? A zoo with no animals, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. My word, that seems a bit strong.
To give you an example of some of the ruder jokes... how
well you know our audience.
Gary Wilmot the dame is talking about how she first met her husband, and she says, I remember when my husband turned to me on my wedding night and said, and then Julian Clary walks on with the Baron, referring to the cat, your pussy's covered in fleas.
I see, so it's one of those cross-talk things by accident. Can I just say my favourite, it's not this, but the Greenwich Theatre, which I always have to put a vote in for, because I think it's fantastic, and Andrew Pollard is still my favourite dame. Not that he was doing it this last year, he had a year off because they did Cinderella down at Greenwich. And so there were other people playing the Ugly Sisters, so he wasn't in it. But a few years ago, he came on as the dame, and he did the I'm a widow, I'm so lonely kind of stuff. All the R's. And then he said, yes, they took my husband into hospital, and the doctors rubbed his back with grease. Well, he went downhill very fast after that. And I think that's a great joke.
Would you ever be a dame?
Andrew Pollard is a genius. Would I ever be a dame? I'm not an actor.
I think you are.
I can write for one, but I couldn't perform. Darling.
Not anymore.
Yeah. But if I was an actor, I'd love to play the dame. Yes, absolutely. It's the best. With the dame, you had the right to ad-lib your way round everyone, steal every scene. The stage is yours.
Unless you're in this pantomime with Julian Clary, because he becomes the dame role in the way.
He becomes the snappy chatter, I'm sure. What role was he playing?
Bow Bells, Spirit of the Bells.
Oh, so he's essentially the fairy godmother kind of thing. Oh, right, that's very interesting. I like the fact that he plays the principal good fairy, and well, no, I'm not making snotty comments, but that's a gender swap. But also, I like the fact that Elaine Page is playing King Rat, essentially. So actually, well done them. But you wouldn't expect those two roles to be the ones you swap gender for.
Speaking of that, there's a bit where Gary Wilmot, as the dame, says, "Inside me, there's a woman waiting to get out," or something like that, and Julian Clary says, "Hang on. Don't confuse the children. I think they're confused enough. I don't even know why they're here, to be honest with you."
Bit postmodern and meta there.
Yes. Yeah. So it really is brilliant. I'm a bit worried for this year.
Do we know what we're getting?
The advertising looks like a starry sky, and I pray to God they're not doing Peter Pan as a pantomime.
Well, I don't mind Peter Pan if you put a dame in it. This is my big concern with Peter Pan. What's yours? Because you like Peter Pan as a musical.
I like it as a musical. Like it as a play.
So why do you not like it as a pantomime?
Because they often just use Barry's script, and it just goes on and on and on and on and on.
It's too reverential.
And it's too serious. It's not a funny play. There's no dame. There's no...
Usually. Sometimes.
And...
The easiest way to put a dame into Peter Pan is to make Nana the dog transmute into a character of a nurse as they fly to Never Never Land.
Be interesting to see what happens. Maybe that's just a starry sky because it looks magical, and that's...
Yeah. As long as it's not the pantomime version of the life of Vincent van Gogh.
Or Haley.
Oh, well, it's funny you should say that, because at the Greenwich Theatre, they did, as I say, Cinderella this year, and the Cinderella's father was Baron Haley, as in Edmund Halley. As in Halley's Comet, but that then allowed them to do Rock Around the Clock, obviously, because they made him Baron Haley. But she lived in the observatory, so actually they were really playing on their Greenwich references. So it's funny you should say that.
Hilarious. So the day I saw the pantomime, the afternoon I went to see Hamilton. So that was a nice day with a nice brisk walk between Victoria and the Palladium.
And may I say what I would consider to be a handbrake turn?
Yes, exactly. Now, we talked about Hamilton at length on the show with Michael and Tonya, and I can't deny it's a brilliant piece. But you and I know Tim Saywood very well, and I hope Tim doesn't mind me saying, when I was at university with Tim, he believed that hip-hop is the future of musical theatre.
I'm just going to tut in the corner, if you don't mind, for the time being, because I think this is all balderdash, but carry on. I think it will be a strain of the future.
Yes.
I don't think it will be the future. I think that's...
But it can't be the past, unless you argue that Gilbert and Sullivan is hip-hop, but that's another discussion entirely.
I've heard someone argue that Hoagy Carmichael wrote one of the earliest rap...
Who?
Hoagy Carmichael is one of the great folk composers of the 20th century in America. He wrote a song called The Monkey Song, and it isn't rap at all, but I've heard it argue that it's a proto-rap. Anyway, by the by.
I want to tell you about a video I saw.
You sure you want to share?
Yes, and it's about a restaurant called... It has nothing to do with musicals, but it's leading to what I want to talk about. It's about a restaurant called The Shed at Shoreditch. And this chap decided to do a social experiment where he got his friends to put fake reviews, amazing reviews of a restaurant on TripAdvisor that doesn't exist. And he took photographs of amazing plastic food and he put it online. And suddenly, after many months of a friend doing it and that friend telling his friend and that friend telling her friend, amazing review after amazing review, this restaurant became the #1 restaurant without existing in London, because people were told it was brilliant. He was getting phone calls asking for a table. Of course, he couldn't give them a table, so he said, "Sorry, we're fully booked." So the hype is bigger. And then he thought, maybe I should actually set up this restaurant and let all the people who've been wanting to come in to the restaurant. So he did, and he blindfolds them upon arrival, leads them through his living room, sits them down, and feeds them Iceland lasagna with garnish, and...
Bog standard food is what you're telling me.
Yeah, and now I'm not saying Hamilton is bog standard musical theatre, it's not. What I'm saying is that if we are told something is brilliant before it exists in our accessibility, we will often think it is brilliant.
I don't disagree with you at all. And this, I think, is going to be my principal problem with Hamilton. Now, I'm going to go into this conversation by telling everyone now that I have no reason...
Shock of the century coming up here, listeners.
No, I have no reason to believe that Hamilton isn't anything other than a very good show. I think it probably has to be. I think it's very difficult to tell unless you've seen it. And even then, if you've seen it, because it doesn't come to you fresh. It doesn't come to you clean. It comes to you wrapped up in possibly the hugest amount of hype I've come across.
Book of Mormon.
Yes, and that's a load of old codswallop. I may be so bold.
Seen it?
I've heard enough of it to know I don't like it. I also don't like the message, and I don't like the tone and the random murder. No, I know enough about Book of Mormon not to want to see it. And this is my problem with Hamilton. I have no doubt it's a perfectly excellent piece of work in its own right. Yes. Whether it's the best show ever, I would doubt. Whether it's actually going to leave as much legacy as everyone says, I would doubt. But my problem with it is, and this is the absolute truth, I'm not interested. It's not a story, as far as I can tell, that interests me in any way. I should, by the way, give the caveat that for Musical Talk, I am going to take one for the team and go and see this wretched show, probably when tickets become available in London, which will probably be in 3 years' time, unless I can get some kind of standby. But the effort to find a standby is not driving me to do it. But my problem is I'm not vastly interested. It's not really about something I'm vastly interested in, which is those early days of
America.
Post-revolutionary America, or the move through the revolution into the setting it up. I can understand why that's of fascination to an American audience. I also understand that its timing is spectacular in terms of its particular approach to liberal thinking and ideas, along with some progressive concepts, or what in musical... Tim Saywood always says, what's new in musical theatre is 20 years old everywhere else. Hip-hop as a concept is so old already. The idea that it's just starting to seep into musical theatre in a significant and embraced way, rather than, we had Into the Hoods a few years ago, and that's still essentially a cult show. It's certainly true that hip-hop is going to be a seam of musical theatre in the future. The idea that it's going to be what musical theatre is going to be in the future is nonsense. It's absolute nonsense, in my view. Let's be honest, musical theatre is always going to be addressed at the middle classes, I'm afraid. That's not to say exclusively, but the middle classes are still the theatre-going classes.
Especially when your Hamilton tickets are
that ridiculously
£250.
Yes, another problem with it. Although I suppose Alexander Hamilton was responsible for setting up the American Reserve, so he's got to make his money some way. I will give you a very good example of why... I personally, when I see hype, all I can hear is manipulation. Not just for Hamilton, for everything. I get this a bit with, occasionally I have to say Disney as well and things like that. But when things are hyped, I think this can't be as good as it is, as it's being purported to be. And therefore I sort of turn on my heels and I get turned off by hype because it feels like an attempt to manipulate me. Add that concept to a show which is about an area and place in history which I haven't a vast amount of interest in, and I must say, I'm going to be honest, it's a perfectly valid way of looking at George III from the American point of view, but there is another point of view. I studied history. My university period of history is the 18th century, and I don't consider George III to be a tyrant. Misguided perhaps. I think the way that colonies were looked after at the time, appalling. This is not a place to get into the rights or wrongs of the American War of Independence / the American Revolution, depending on how you want to classify it. So please don't write, everybody. I'm not vastly interested in the American experience. I'm much more interested in British court matters and the British political scene afterwards. William Pitt the Younger is my favourite character from history. Not many musicals with him.
Thos's musical, The Pits, will be coming soon.
Well, there was more than one, so you can actually do that. But I know something of the era, I know something of the characters, but I'm not vastly interested in it. In Britain, no one's ever heard of him, and they still don't know. And this is my Christmas dinner story. I went to what can only be described as the most bourgeois of all occurrences, a pre-Christmas dinner. And I think Hamilton had only opened in that week. And the newspapers were full of it, and the television review shows were full of it, and Will Gompertz was talking about it on the television, the BBC's culture correspondent. So everyone was talking about it, and round the table they started talking about it. They were also talking about The Crown, incidentally, if you want another example of where hype is higher than content. They were banging on about how wonderful it was, and and how everyone must see it. Now they didn't know me from Adam, these people, most of them, and so they didn't know I was interested in musical theatre.
What were you doing in their house then?
I knew the host.
Okay.
They were talking about it, and I was just listening. I was very interested to hear what they were talking about. And what they did was they repeated everything I'd read in the newspapers, everything I'd heard on the television, everything I'd heard on the radio, everything I'd read on a poster on the side of a bus, but I hadn't heard an original thought. Anyway, so they were banging on about it. And then I said to them, "Are you going to go and see it?" And they all went quiet, because none of them were actually going to go and see it. What they wanted to do was that very British thing, and indeed any country, but of appearing to be on trend without actually putting the effort in. So it was all regurgitated nonsense without actually the intent of seeing it. And then I said to them, "By the way, who do you think Alexander Hamilton was?" And they said, "Wasn't he one of the early presidents of America?" And I said, "No, he wasn't." And then they backtracked, and there was a particularly voluble lady. She'd had a drink, and she said to me, "Oh, well," she said, "this is a way for me to learn." And she said, "One of my favourite musicals is Les Miserables." She said, "I've learned everything."
About the French Revolution.
You've preempted me. It's exactly what she said. She said, "Everything I've learnt about the French Revolution, I learnt from Les Miserables." And I said, "It's not about the French Revolution.
Student revolution."
It's about 60 years later. It's a different century, for goodness sake. Anyway, so the upshot was there's an awful lot of people talking an awful lot of balderdash about this show. Now, let us not judge the show on its hype. Oh, by the way, I will just give you a sense of hype. Hype can only be distorting, not just for Hamilton, for everything else. There's a poster in London at the moment for The Lion King, and it says there's no other show like it. Well, there is another show like it. It's called Hamlet. And I think it's been around a bit longer. So, these things are designed to draw people in.
It doesn't have an elephant walking down the aisle, though, does it?
Well, nor does, in fairness, The Lion King in actuality.
True.
It would be the elephant in the room. But the circumstances are that hype is designed to draw people in. But the problem is it can also work against that. And I'm quite sensitive to being manipulated. I don't like it. So add the idea of everybody just regurgitating all the comments that a few people have made with a story about an era of history I'm not vastly interested in, or rather an aspect of history I'm not particularly interested in. Strip all that away. Actually, I would like to see Hamilton now, in 3 years' time or whenever, just to see if these have been described as prejudices, or and if Mike Gordon Shapiro is listening, I will say curmudgeonly behaviour is how I was described by him. Hello, Mike. Lovely hearing from you.
Love you.
I do know. Mike's a lovely man. He did it. He quite rightly picked me up on curmudgeonly comments in a good-humoured way. But
that should be our tagline.
Possibly.
Curmudgeonly comments in a good-humoured way.
Well, I hope we can sometimes rise above that. The circumstances are still, I'm not interested. It might be great.
But you're interested in the craft of musical theatre, aren't you?
Yes. But I will tell you that, I've watched there's 3 iterations of the King George III song, aren't there? I've watched those on YouTube. Yeah. And what I hear, I must say, I quite like the conceit of more or less the same song being sung in, this is the way it appeared to me at least, and you can tell me I'm wrong, but 3 songs being sung in a different way in the parallel of a breakup in the relationship. And that's quite witty in its own way. Did I think the song was any good? Not really. It was tolerably catchy, I suppose. Did I enjoy the performance? Well, it was a bit cartoon. It's not the George III I'm aware of, but I appreciate it's not really doing that, and it's not really about George III. I appreciate he is a sort of totemic character in some senses.
The audience when I saw it absolutely loved him.
Yeah.
Because he's played by a Brit knowingly, unlike on Broadway where it's played by an American trying to play a Brit.
You're suggesting there's a transatlantic accent which doesn't ring true.
Well, it works much better with a British audience because it's weird. We're seeing an American's version of American history with a British element that's all done by British people. So there's something odd going on, and I don't think it'll last longer than 3 or 4 years here. It's a very, very well crafted show. It's a bit overwhelming in its brilliance as regards lyrical wordplay and just the endless rhymes that he comes up with. It is stunning what Lin-Manuel Miranda is able to do.
I'm sure that's true. Can I just say, by the way, however, I saw him being interviewed in that week it was being opened. I actually thought he came across tremendously well. I thought he came across a damn sight better than the fawning people trying to interview him. Because one person actually stood and interviewed him on British television and said, "Are you the new William Shakespeare?"
Well, he's been compared to Shakespeare.
Yes,
well, he's been telling history in a new way, which is what Shakespeare did in the time.
Can I say what I liked about him was he laughed and said no, which is the right answer. I don't mean to be rude, the people who wrote Dad's Army were telling history in a new way does not make them like Shakespeare. I would imagine if I was him, I'd want to be remembered for carving out a particular line with his name on it rather than being compared to other people. As I say, I'm sure there's craft in it. I'm sure there's wit in it, in the same way that I suspect, I have no doubt that Matilda, and you're going to tell me it's a great show, and you've said it before, I'm sure it's full of craft. I have no doubt to believe it isn't. Still not interested in it in any way whatsoever. Haven't seen it. It just leaves me cold. I'm just not interested. Once again, the hype did for me on that. I like things to seep into my consciousness and then be confirmed as good, rather than being told with a hammer regularly. And I do mean that this is the best thing ever and nothing can ever top it. And not only that, all future musical theatre is going to be cast in its image. I can tell you now, if all musical theatre is cast in its image, you won't be hearing much more from me in a couple of years' time. Although, of course, I will always have Gilbert and Sullivan. I don't want anyone to go away thinking this man is just prejudiced against the show. I'm not. I'm not interested in it, which is a very subtly different position. I've been further turned off by the appalling hype. However, when the dust settles, I will tootle along and I will let you know my views. I will also say this. The thing that keeps coming into my mind, and people can say this is an unworthy comparison, as unworthy as comparing the composer with Shakespeare, is that I keep thinking of Allegro, where you've got a show that lived for the length of its actual professional life on the hype of, in this case, its composers, Rodgers and Hammerstein, and sold out for 3 years. This all sounds very familiar. But then it stopped, and there was no walk up afterwards. It only lived on its pre-sales, the hype element of it, and then couldn't walk in the world, which is ironic, bearing in mind that walking is one of the thematic motifs of the piece. And that is why we had to wait 70 odd years for it to come to Europe. The European premiere was a couple of years ago in London. Oh, and funnily enough, I think that show's very good, but it's taken 70 years to prove it. I would like to know what people do think of this show in 70 years' time. I'll let you know, Nick.
The reason I want you to see it, Thos, is because I know it's the kind of thing that you're not interested in, and that's why I'm so curious to hear, for a show that is so lauded for its brilliance and its structure and lyrical wordplay and technical dexterity that it displays, in one could argue quite a new way. I mean, we're going to be talking in a soon on the podcast to Alex Lacamoire, who is the orchestrator, original conductor, musical supervisor, and arranger.
What a morning that was.
Of Hamilton. Be interesting to hear what he has to say about the piece.
Yeah. This is where hype damages things. The people involved in it have clearly created a show which has worth in its own right. Whether the worth is at the level at which it's being offered, I would doubt. However, that doesn't stop it being a fantastic show. I just don't think it's going to be the groundbreaking show, the most amazing show ever, because everyone was saying this a few years about something else, and that didn't generate any future life either.
See, I think it's a thing of these days. And I want to ask you, what was the hype?
What is the thing of these days?
Well, hype. Because of social media and the messages spread so quickly, and if you disagree with someone, you're wrong, and everyone's able to express, as I said, express their opinion so quickly. What was the hype like for Les Miserables or Phantom of the Opera? These shows that are...
Phantom, I would be able to give you some idea on, because I have to say I don't remember the other two waddling into town, really. I remember Martin Guerre coming into town, and there was an awful lot of nonsense about that. And what an old pile of...
Merde.
No, just putting it in a different language doesn't change the word, does it? I was going to say, what a tumble-down cottage that proved to be. They had to rebuild it several times, and it doesn't come back, does it? Phantom of the Opera, I remember the hype on that. But once again, hype seemed to work in a slightly different way. Merchandising as well, because obviously the way that Andrew Lloyd Webber, and this is clever in its own way, gets interest in a show is to make sure that the songs are out there before the show is. And of course,
like Rodgers and Hammerstein did, of course.
Yes, in many ways that's true. But in the hit parade of the the 1980s, the pop charts, hype came with that. There was other hype that I suppose it's what you might call social hype as well. I don't mean
Hamilton's done that too. They've got songs in the charts covered by other bands. I mean, that's how big Hamilton is in the States. You've now got...
Yeah, but over here?
Possibly. I'm the wrong person to ask.
And I'm even less correct. But I was going to say, when it comes to Phantom of the Opera, there was the relationship with Andrew Lloyd Webber and Sarah Brightman, the singer. So there was, the press were always going to have a field day on this. And then the songs did tremendously well. So the hype, such as it is, was really around the creatives and about these songs which are famous. It wasn't really about the show per se. I must say it had a nifty bit of advertising in terms of its poster image. The black... poster,
logo,
if you like, with the white...
The mask that actually isn't the mask.
No, but it doesn't matter what it is or isn't. It's what it looks like and what it feels like, and that's...
The same with Cats as well, with the eye. That's what Cameron was really good at. And
I had an eye for it. And so it wasn't all-encompassing. And no one was saying Phantom of the Opera is the greatest thing ever written, and no one was saying that this is what the future of musical theatre is, because, frankly, that's such a preposterous thing to say. I mean, there is an element of wanting to create trends and then tell the people that you created that trend. And that's much easier to do, as you quite rightly said, in the world of social media. It doesn't make it true, though.
We are the greatest musical theatre podcast ever, though.
We are
because we say so on Twitter.
And we are the greatest musical theatre podcast called Musical Talk ever. Yes, there will be a few musicals in the future that tries to do what this does, and they'll be written off as pale imitation. It's a different kind of hype, but The Mousetrap, not a musical, just a piece of drama, a whodunit, a fairly creaky one at that. It's been on for 1,000,000 years. It's the first recorded show ever.
Jonathan was at the opening night.
Just after coming out of Floridor. But it was, but everyone knows it. It's been running 1,000 years. No person who lives in London ever goes to see... And I have seen... You're right, yes, you've just put your hand up. You have seen it, I have seen it. But on the whole, people don't go out to a night. You go as a curiosity piece. You don't go to see the show itself. You go because it's been on for a number of years. It mostly survives on international tourism. And that's fine. I'm not criticising it in any way.
You could say it's the same with Les Mis and Phantom.
Yes, although I think Les Mis actually does draw the crowds in. Although Les Mis is... forgive me, one of these days we'll actually have to talk about shows which are aimed at... what I think of as people up to, young people up to 30. There are what I think of as sort of primer shows. Wicked is one of them. Les Mis is one of them. That's not to say you can't enjoy it when you're older, but the people who really like those shows seem to be the up-and-coming generation of people who are just discovering musical theatre and therefore get very excited by what the latest thing is. Whereas you get a few years on the clock, you think, hang on, everything here has been done before. And then that's when you discover that actually, or I think, a successful musical... relies on a whole bunch of things, but if you get the book wrong, you haven't got a show. Now, I'm not saying for 1 second Hamilton hasn't got the book right. I'm sure it's got the book right for the show it's trying to tell. I just don't happen to be interested in it. But I'm sure if I was learning, if I was 15 and I was just discovering musical theatre for the first time, I would think this was the bee's knees because it's the big fashionable show in the way that Wicked was 10, 12 years ago. I'm never going to be the right person for this show in some senses because when I was 17, the two shows I went to see, I think I've said 1987 that when I started going to the theatre on my own, I've said this in other episodes, I went to see Into the Woods at the Phoenix and I went to see the 100th anniversary revival of Ruddigore at Sadler's Wells.
Of course you did.
Of course I did. And, musical theatre I think grabs you at just the right age and this feels like a big old blustery show at just the right age. But what will I, in my decrepitude, think of it when I do finally get to see it?
What I love about Musical Talk is we will cover the history of this show as it travels through the years, and we might be surprised. You might love it, Thos.
No, and I'm not ruling that out. I'm not saying for 1 second I do not like this show. I'm not saying I won't like this show. I can say I don't like the hype, and I can say I am not at this moment interested. And those are the only 4 facts really we've been talking about. However, I'm very happy to be proven wrong.
Musical Talk, the UK independent musical theatre podcast.
I'm doing Annie at the moment. I'll rephrase that. I'm involved with a production of Annie at the stage school where I teach. I want to talk to you about Annie.
Please do.
Because it's not a show...
I heart Charles Stroud.
So do I. I listen to your chats with him, and you can go back into the archive and listen to them. Not you, Thos, obviously, because you were there.
I
But
do listen to them, though. I will say, my meeting with Charles Strauss, or my meetings with Charles Strauss, are actually still two of my favourite conversations for musical talk. Not my only favourites, but Charles Strauss was such a lovely, lovely man. He still is. But he is, in my view, a wonderful writer and so
dare I say a
self-deprecating.
very underrated writer.
Oh, gosh, yes, absolutely.
Because the minute I stand doing Annie, everyone just rolls their eyes.
They do, yeah.
I don't think it deserves that reputation. Now, saying that, I haven't actually yet seen Annie on stage. And
You should say that there's a London production which is just coming to its end
There
now.
is.
So Annie's been very up at the
Yeah.
moment.
with Miranda Hart and now Maria, and then Craig Revel Horwood, and then Mira Sayal playing the role of Miss Hannigan. But we're going through the songs, and everyone knows Hard Knock Life, and everyone knows Tomorrow, and some people sort of know maybe. But there's some very, very good other stuff in Annie.
I'd like to thank you, Henry Hoover.
That is a brilliant
It's
song.
a fantastic song, and satirically sharp, even though it's a historic song, about the Great Depression and the American president who wasn't really able to budge America out of it. It's got teeth, and you still feel those teeth.
But it's a it's a limerick, isn't it? Effectively,
It's a lyric first song, but a good composer knows how to do lyrics first songs and melody first songs, and melody and lyric equally songs.
And the difficult thing is when you're working with 8-year-olds, how to do sarcastic irony in the fact that they're singing, "We like to thank you, Herbert Hoover," and they're saying, well, why do they like to thank them? Why is it not sad anymore? And it's almost too clever for its own good.
Yes, although you're working with a youth cast, of course, if you actually see Annie, it's not really. We'd like to thank you, Herbert Hoover. Exactly. They're adult characters played by adult performers, so I don't think you have that problem. So you've got an extra issue there. You're quite right. What can we say about Annie that hasn't been already said? Probably very little, but it therefore is worth repeating. I will say this: you're right. People do roll their eyes at it, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it's familiarity breeds contempt, But I think this is something that we should all just for 1 second sit down and marvel at the idea that there are not many songs at all, and certainly not many songs from the world of musical theatre, where you could probably go into the street anywhere or nearly anywhere in the world and say, "The sun will come out," and stop there, and someone else will either say it in their head or out loud, "Tomorrow." Everybody knows it, and that is a remarkable achievement. In fact, I remember Charles Strauss saying that when they were trying to get investors interested in Annie, Charles said that he and Martin Charnin were singing the songs to potential backers, all of whom said no, thank you very much. And then a year later, they got a telephone call from a couple who were investors, who then said, "We would like to do the show. Me and my wife have been humming songs still, and we were trying to work out where they came from, and we realised it came from your dummy recordings that you made a year ago." So there's something in that. Those songs have got hooks. There is also, they're not all as famous as that, so you're right, there's a much broader score. I think the other problem, and funnily enough, I think this is much more of a British problem than an American problem. It's that anti-sentimentalist streak that is still to be found, I think, in Britain in certain places, if not just in me, which is that it's about a little girl for whom her life is bad and then it gets good in the most, what appears to be a simple arc. If you cut it down, actually what people know about the Annie story is she's an orphan and then she gets adopted. Funnily enough, the villain character isn't really sort of featured in most people's understanding of the story if they don't know it.
Of that story, we have two versions. One is Oliver.
Oh, I see what you mean.
And the other one is Matilda.
Yeah, I suppose so.
And
is there room for another?
Well, Annie.
Yeah. But our two are British, so we connect immediately with them.
The thing is, it is the American. It's the American dream. It's all the White House stuff that we groan at the patriotism.
Do you know, once again, I don't think most people realise that the president turns up in it. I don't think people see that at all. I think Daddy Warbucks is known. There's something slightly disturbing about that name, but, daddy behaviour with a little girl. Does Annie actually, and this is the character of Annie, not the musical, the character of Annie, does she have a character?
Does she do anything?
Does she have a character? I mean, it's the same problem with Oliver, actually.
And Charlie in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory on stage, where he turns up at the right place at the right time, and he wins at the end.
He's a wet old stick, if I may say.
And that's the difference between, and a lot of critics picked up on this comparing Matilda with Annie. So Matilda actually does something.
She's a protagonist.
Yes. I want to talk to you about the different versions of Annie, because
Oh,
we
yeah.
have the stage show, we have the junior version, which I'm working on. We also have the film, which is so different.
Yeah, it's got
To
that
the stage
dreadful
show.
dog song in it.
And they cut tomorrow and put it later on,
Yeah, it's repositioned, isn't it?
and it opens the credits, which is odd, I thought. And I don't like NYC as a song, because it just kind of fizzles out, and you think a song like that would have a big ending, but I'm sure it's purely for book.
Yeah.
But whereas in the film, they do, in the movies, Daddy Warbucks hires Radio City Music Hall and they go and watch a film, but it's a stage show.
They did used to run live shows before the films at Radio City, and
I didn't know that,
there was
so
two big American cinemas, weren't there? The Roxy, I think that's the one. Yeah, now, if you can dig it out, this is an obscure piece of trivia. There's a really obscure Cole Porter song where I think he conflates the two to make the Roxy Radio City Cinema, which is the biggest cinema ever, and it's a woman singing about, it's so extravagant. The drinking fountains are in fact Roman statues. The actors look like midgets because the place is so big. They say that the gods are so high that if you faint due to altitude sickness, they send up a Saint Bernard dog. The shows are so lavish. They used to say that it was just still occasionally when you see a film in London, you might get the Wurlitzer come up for a little bit. I've seen that for Disney films, or occasionally a little pre-show in the preview week or the premiere week, but you don't really get anything. But these shows, they used to lay everybody on before you even saw the films. So that is actually a much more accurate representation of what you're talking about.
Maybe that's what they were doing.
I will just say briefly, funnily enough, and it takes us back to Annie in a slightly different way. This Cole Porter song makes a joke about, the casts are so lavish that Mrs. Roosevelt is in the cast. And of course, it's President Roosevelt who's the president in Annie. There we are. It's full circle. Thank you, Cole Porter.
But I thought it was an interesting thing to have the lavish Busby Berkeley style stage show in a cinema. But
Yeah.
maybe if that's what they did, that's what they did, and I didn't know that. So thank you. Tell me about the Annie sequels, because that's
Well, it's two, aren't
Yes.
there? There's Annie 2, and then there's Annie the other. I've forgotten what the title of the one that was speech marked successful. There's Annie 2, which fortunately you can buy these scores, and I've got them. And I think Annie 2 is the one that's got a beautiful, beautiful song. And now I'm going to have to rack my brains to remember what it's called, but it's a genuinely wistful song about a sort of lovelorn woman who's lamenting that the relationship with a man just didn't quite work out. And, it's got a line in it which is something like, "We could have been wonderful." And funnily enough, it's that "we" that kills me every time I hear it. Now, I'm not doing it justice. It's worth digging out. What is lovely is that it's a totally different sequel to the one that actually came out, and was performed, I think. I don't think Annie 2 ever got properly done, and has fallen by the wayside. But then there is the other one, and I can't now remember what it's called.
which is Hannigan's Revenge.
I think it probably is, although isn't that not the name of the film? Can't remember. Certainly she's in it again. And but then there's been a number of Annie sequel films which are not musicals.
Oh, okay. Because there was the Disney musical in the 90s with Kristen Chenoweth and Alan Cumming and Kathy Bates. But then there was I think they did an African-American
indeed,
version
yeah,
of
yeah.
Annie as well, which had some new material
Oh, really?
in it. So it seems to have
Yeah, I mean,
mutated into various forms.
it would be very interesting, actually, to try and gather all together what evidence there is of all the different versions. The original version, as you say, Annie 2, the other Annie sequel, the various versions of it. I bet Midler did a version, didn't she? I think she was Miss...
Possibly.
I'm sure she's been Miss Hannigan somewhere. Actually doing a compare and contrast, although some of them, as I say, aren't actually musicals, although you'd stick a song in here and there from the existing sort of canon of songs. Once again, Charles Strauss, he said, Annie's been a lovely little girl and she looks after her daddy. Charles Strauss will be remembered because of Annie. He's done a lot of other truly brilliant stuff. Bye Bye Birdie is actually a great musical, and there's a lot of other good stuff he's done. And I've said this before on Musical Talk, then there's all the might have beens. He was actually in negotiation to do a Star Wars musical. And you think, what might have happened? But anyway, so many good things have come out of Charles Strauss, but Annie is clearly the one that's going to be remembered, and I think rightfully so. Can I just say that the wonderful Boylan sisters ought to be mentioned, because that's another wonderful song. She's singing along to the character on the radio who's singing a real 1920s, 1930s kind of, let's all be happy song. But it's what's beautiful about it is you can hear how the staging works even on the recording. She is singing along to a radio. That's one of the very few areas of input of pleasure into her life. And so you get the song in the background and her singing along to it. So there's lots of lovely stuff in Annie. And as you say, the score is so much broader than just Tomorrow.
Maybe, and the other one, Hard Knock Life, which is also a very, very good song. And they're very difficult as well. They're very detailed in their rhythms, and because the kids sort of know them, they don't know them. They know their own version.
They've learnt their version quite, and do you know that's the hardest thing to unlearn, isn't it? We've all done it. You hear pop songs, and then if you have to then learn them properly, you think, hang on, even this piece of old nonsense pop is a bit more sophisticated than I thought.
I'll let you know how the production goes. I'm very enjoying it, but it's so nice to do a show that I don't know.
Yeah.
And to get to know it and to see the complexity in the score. It's only the little version. We're not doing the full version, so there's no... I don't even know what songs are not in it.
Oh, well, I won't ask you my next question then. But let's move on to the next thing. Will you therefore go on and try and listen to the full score and indeed the other sequels?
I think I have most of the cast recordings of Annie, and I have been listening to them. I watched the first film. I kind of lost interest when it got a bit silly with helicopters and the Brooklyn Bridge or something like that, and
leave that for the James Bond films.
It's the middle film that I need to see, which is the most faithful version of the stage show. But I haven't gone to see the stage show because I don't want to be influenced by another production.
Well, let us go back to your original point. And I think it's telling, the recent London production. You mention Annie to people, they roll their eyes. And we try to analyse why that might be. And it's partly the cutesy nature of the slightly vacuous girl. Thinking back to the advertising of the London production, it has all been about Miss Hannigan. I can't even remember if if the Annie character, the actress, is in it on the posters. No. All I remember is looking at the actors who have been put up to play Miss Hannigan, who are, the whole poster is them.
But she's a great character. I mean,
she is a great character, absolutely. Scheming, obviously scheming.
Drunk.
Well, do you know what? In a strange way, she reminds me a little bit of a pantomime dame. Possibly, actually, because she's a villain, so she's going to be like one of the ugly sisters. But the thing about pantomime dames is that they are not in any way... I'm going to say something obvious. They're not
evil.
Well, sometimes they're not, but they're not subtle. They are usually lovelorn, and they wear their emotions on their sleeve. The widowed mothers, the widow twankies, and all those characters, and even in the Gary Wilmot character, it's all about, I'm feeling so sad today, boys and girls, and you get the R's, no, I'm sadder than that. But it is, they're desperate for love, and they aren't subtle in trying to get it. They cling on to the man they've picked, or it's really in your face. But so there's no subtlety. Now you might say, well, in pantomime's not subtle anyway, and that's true. But in most of the characters, there's no malignancy. The only malignant dames in pantomime are the ugly sisters. And even then, it's because they're truly lovelorn. They're lonely, if they've been properly written. Hannigan is not a subtle character. You, the audience, are always going to be clever. You can see what she's doing. And is she truly evil? Well, she's bored and tired and fed up and trapped by her very small life.
Well, it's this whole kind of, is she a villain, is she not? She's a Fagin.
Yeah, although, funnily enough, I think Fagin is clearly not a villain in most adaptations of most musical versions of it, isn't he? I mean, he's a sort of avuncular. Bill Sikes has got all the villainous aspects. He's actually, when I say avuncular, actually he is. He's like Uncle Fagin. Miss Hannigan is not quite like that.
No, but you still have the other villains, which are the Easy Street, Rooster and Lily. Is that her name?
I'm going to rely on you. You've read it more recently than I.
So you've got the real villains, and then you have the kind of the first villain, as it were, who's the thing that's stopping our main character, the Fagin, or Bumble, I guess you could say, those kind of
amoral characters.
The barriers in a way.
Yeah.
Obviously, the only version of Miss Hannigan I've ever seen is Carol Burnett, who's about as subtle as a fish across the face.
Yes, but that is what the character requires. So that's not a bad performance. She's playing that very well.
But I wonder how Miranda Hart did it. I wonder how Craig Howard did it. Interesting you bring up the Dame element. Mira Sayal, very good actress. So it is right. There's no mention of Annie apart from the name in the poster. It's all about the star playing Miss Hannigan. And that's because it's more of a meaty role because she has to do stuff as opposed to Annie.
She's the protagonist.
Annie's just, it's a nice day and all that kind of stuff.
Cutesy pie beyond belief in some senses. Yeah, she's a huge optimist under circumstances which she really oughtn't to be.
But that's what you needed in the Great Depression. You needed that person to say things will get better.
Yeah, but of course it wasn't It's not from the Great Depression, the story, is it? It's very much a...
But the cartoons were.
You mean you're talking about the original comic strip?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. It's based on the concept and characters, isn't it? It's not based on the story of Annie as a musical, but...
Do we know what she was like in the comic strips?
Well, I know she didn't have irises. Very odd. For some reason, just none of the characters, I think,
Went through the sun
they just
tomorrow.
had little circles where their eyes are, and it just looks very strange to me. And with a modern eye, I don't know enough about it because I don't think they were reproduced in this country particularly, being as they were so tremendously American.
I'll let you know tomorrow, maybe. Yes.
Oh, tomorrow, ho ho,
Maybe.
I see what you are doing there.
Yeah.
That is very funny. If it goes well, you must get them to do the junior version of Annie 2 or Annie sequel or whatever it
Annie
is.
12.
Yes.
Anything.
Anything goes. Ha ha.
Anything can happen.
Back to Culled Collation.
Thos, thank you very much for
As
joining me on
always,
this
it's a
lovely
pleasure for me
episode.
to hear myself. Thank you.
Yes, and
For more information about Musical Talk, please visit our website at musicaltalk.co.uk. You can email us at feedback@musicaltalk.co.uk, listen to past episodes on iTunes and YouTube, and follow our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
He and Michael Martin. Oh,
Martin Charlie.
thank you. He and my... Oh, God.